What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, the GOAT Magnus Carlsen is in total shock as the Blitz specialist Daniel Naroditsky, aka Vladimir Kramnik's latest victim, plays a brilliant rook sacrifice in one of their latest chess.com Blitz games. Now in the game, Daniel Naroditsky is playing as white. He opens 1e4, best by test, and Magnus Carlsen does go 1c5 to Sicilian Defense. Now we have knight to f3 and e6, so far so good. And now instead of d4, the open Sicilian and the main line, Daniel does play the move c3, and this is sort of a delayed Alapin variation. Now here in this position, black can go knight to f6 or d5, breaking in the center, and in this game, Magnus does go d5, a very solid idea. Now here Daniel, he plays the main idea, e takes d5, taking the pawn on d5, and Magnus does recapture with the queen. Queen takes d5 on the board, and that is the main line. If you take with the e-pawn, then you do risk getting an isolated pawn on the d5 square, and that would be a little bit bad for black. All right, now in this position, d4, breaking in the center for Daniel, and Magnus goes knight to f6. So far, so good. Now here in this position, we have one of the first branching points of the game, and here Daniel, he doesn't develop his light-squared bishop. That would be the standard idea. Instead, he actually goes knight to a3, a very interesting sideline, and this move has become extremely trendy at the highest level lately. All right, now Magnus, a6, blocking the idea of knight to b5. However, the knight is not done, and it goes to a different square. Here actually goes knight to c4, a very interesting rerouting idea. And now from here, the knight is eyeing the e3 square. That would be a good square for the knight, and it would put pressure on the queen on the d5 square. And believe it or not, that is what happens. All right, now Magnus, knight b d7 develops the knight. Then Daniel, bishop e2. And then we have b5 for Magnus expanding on the queen side, a very typical idea in the Sicilian defense for black. And now, of course, here Daniel, he does go knight to e3, completing that rerouting idea of the knight. Knight to a3 to c4 to e3, putting pressure on the queen on d5. And that, of course, is one of the main ideas of knight to a3 that we saw on move 6 earlier. Now here Magnus, queen c6 on the board, a good square for the queen. And now here Daniel, he makes maybe his first mistake of the game. In this position, the best idea would perhaps be short castles or a4, expanding on the queen side and putting pressure on that pawn on b5, threatening a takes b5, and black would have to do something like bishop b7, trying to defend that rook on a8 before recapturing on b5. However, instead of that, here in this position, he actually jumps forward with his knight to e5 on the board, and this does put pressure on the knight on d7 and the queen on c6, and that pawn on g2, very importantly, is being defended by the knight on e3, so yet another idea behind that knight to e3 rerouting idea. But now here in this position, that knight on the e5 square is not very well placed, and Magnus has the option to go queen c7, just retreating and then threatening knight takes e5, and if Daniel does take on d7, black recaptures with the bishop, and that would speed up his development on the queen side. However, instead of that, here Magnus, he's in a fighting mood. He actually takes on e5, so knight takes e5, returning the mistake. This is also a slightly dubious idea. And here Daniel, he will get an advantage in the opening. So we have e takes d5. Now this move does hit the knight on f6. The knight has to go somewhere. Where is it going to go? Well, it turns out you have to find the right square right now. For example, if you go knight to e4, that move looks logical. However, after the sequence f3, then the only good square for the knight is g5, and then you go h4, and you actually win the knight. So knight to e4 would be a blunder. Instead of that here, Magnus Carlsen, he does go knight d5. That is the best square for the knight. So Magnus Carlsen not falling for any traps here. Now in this position, Daniel, he increased the pressure with a very simple idea, bishop f3, pinning that knight on d5 to the queen on the c6 square. So now the bishop, very, very active on this long diagonal, and black is going to have to find a way to relieve the pressure right now. So Magnus Carlsen here, he starts with the move bishop b7, a very solid idea, defending that knight on d5. Of course, knight takes d5, and then bishop takes was being threatened. That would win a pawn, but now you cannot win a pawn as that bishop does support that d5 square. And beyond that, here, black may go queen c7 in the future, and that bishop will cover this long diagonal very, very well, relieving some of the pressure. All right, now Daniel, short castles on the board, very typical idea. And here Magnus, instead of going bishop e7 and then short castles, perhaps the safest idea, he plays a slightly more ambitious idea. He actually goes rook d8, developing the rook on the open d file and setting up ideas like knight takes e3 with the discovered attack of the rook on the queen. So a very good idea in Blitz, creating threats and fighting for the initiative. Now here, Daniel, what should he be doing about this threat of, say, knight takes e3, knight to f4, knight takes c3, and so on, all these discovered attacks? Well, the safest idea would be queen to e2, the idea being queen e2, then rook d1, and your queen and your rook are on very decent squares. However, instead of that here, Daniel, he actually goes c4, breaking on the queen side, This is a very ambitious idea. Here he is trying to break up black's pawn structure on the queen side. However, he's ignoring the idea of, say, knight takes e3. Now, technically, that would not work out for black yet, as the move bishop takes c6 would win the queen with check, so that would be devastating. However, this will be a big threat in the future. Now, after c4, black is going to have to respond. In the game, Magnus does go b takes c4, so b takes c4 on the board, then knight takes c4 for Daniel, and now here Magnus finally goes bishop e7, the standard developing move, intending short castles on the king side next, and his king will be relatively safe on the king side. All right, here Daniel, once again, he has to find the right plan. Most of his pieces are developed, so what is it going to be? Well, there are a variety of good ideas. For example, bishop d2 intending rook c1 is very playable, and again, queen to e2 intending rook d1, also very playable. Instead of that, Daniel goes for a more active idea. He immediately jumps in with the knight to the a5 square. So knight to a5 on the board, forking both the bishop on b7 and that queen on c6. Now Daniel will win the bishop pair, that is inevitable, and that will give Daniel very good long-term attacking chances in this game. All right, Magnus, queen b5 on the board, then we have knight takes and queen takes. So again, Daniel does win that bishop pair, and now suddenly he does have very good attacking chances on the king side, not to mention his better pawn structure on the queen side. For example, you could see Magnus going potentially bishop d4, then queen to h5 in the future, putting pressure on that pawn on h7, or even queen g4, putting pressure on that pawn on g7. So again, Daniel is going to have a lot of attacking ideas in this game. However, before doing that, he actually jumps in with the queen to the a4 square, queen to a4 on the board, and this is a very, very strong move. The idea being you hit the king with check, and then you want to go queen to g4, hitting that g7 pawn. And then if black castles, you will have the idea bishop to h6, again pressuring g7, and that pawn will be pinned to the king on g8 as the queen will be lining up with the king. So this queen to a4 idea is very, very dangerous. Let's see how it plays out. Here Magnus, queen b5 on the board, blocks the check. You definitely don't want to go queen takes b5. That would improve black's pawn structure and get the queens off the board. So with that in mind, here the move is queen to g4, of course, pressuring that pawn on g7. And again, the idea, if short castles, then bishop h6 would be absolutely devastating. It would be almost impossible to defend that g7 point. So with that in mind, what are black's options here? Well, he has two main ideas. One is g6. That does technically defend the king side. However, after bishop h6, those dark squares would be just so weak forever. So instead of that here, Magnus Carlsen, he does go king to f8. A very decent defensive move. It's not a move you want to make, but it is the best move in the position. All right, now Daniel, rook d1, activating the rook on the board. Very good idea. And now Magnus. In this position, he has to find a good way to get counterplay, and he has to get it fast. And you know what? This is a good time for a puzzle. Try to find the best strategic idea in this position for Magnus. Try to find the best plan for him in this position to get counterplay. Magnus plays a very strong idea and is very thematic for high-level chess right now. And by the way, while you're at it, go ahead and smash that YouTube like button for me. Thank you so much for doing that. It helps me out so much. All right, now, in this position, Magnus Carlsen, with his king on f8 and his rook on h8, that rook is temporarily out of the game. However, he finds a way to activate it immediately, and he does that with the very strong idea h5, expanding on the king side, pressuring the queen, and activating that alpha 0 h-pawn. All right, what's the idea? Well, with that rook on h8, Magnus may even want to go h4 and then h3, and suddenly he will have counterplay on the king side. His king is going to stay on f8. That's potentially the best square for the king right now, and the rook will be active. And overall, Magnus will have counterplay in this game. All right, from here, where should the queen move to? If you go to queen g3, then h4 is the follow-up move. That would be dangerous. So instead here, Daniel, he goes queen to e4, keeping the queen centralized and getting out of the idea of h4 with tempo on the queen. So likely the best square for the queen. Now here, Magnus, g6 on the board, a strong idea. Potentially wanting to go king g7 with the fianchetto of the king on the g7 square. And again, h4 and h3 will be a threat in the future. Now here, Daniel, what should he be doing? In the game, he finds the very simple idea, bishop e2, retreating the bishop and putting pressure on the queen on b5. Of course, there were other ideas, for example, a4, pressuring the queen, or b3, intending perhaps bishop b2 or bishop a3 was also playable. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he's got to get his queen out of the attack. He does that with the move queen b6, very solid idea. And now Daniel, bishop c4, putting more pressure on that knight on d5. Now the threat is simply bishop takes d5, then e takes, then rook takes, winning a pawn, and that would just be absolutely devastating for Magnus Carlsen. However, here, he actually ignores the threat. He just goes king g7, and here Daniel will have the option of bishop takes d5, again, then rook takes d5, winning a pawn. However, in the game, he does not go for it. And here's a good question. Why did Daniel not go for that move, bishop takes d5, in this game? Again, if you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video and try to solve that one. Here's the solution. All right, if you go bishop takes d5, then e takes, then rook takes, the problem is very simple. Queen c6, and that rook on d5 will be pinned to the queen on e4, meaning you will lose the rook on d5. That will be devastating. So that is not a good idea for Daniel Naroditsky in this game. Instead, here in this position, he does go queen to e2, just retreating the queen to a better square and giving up on that idea of bishop takes d5 almost altogether. Again, there were other moves you could play. For example, h3, a4, and so on. A lot of good waiting moves. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he plays a good waiting move himself. a5, expanding on the queen side, potentially threatening a4 and a3 in the future. A very common idea in high-level chess right now. Now here, Daniel, he finds a very active idea to increase the pressure on Magnus Carlsen's position. A very good idea in general, but especially in Blitz when you want to fight for the initiative. Here he goes rook d3, the rook lift on the third rank. Now the idea is this rook has access to the f3, the g3, and the h3 squares in the future if it needs it, and there will be various sacrificial ideas on the king side with the rook. Now here, Magnus, queen c6, increase the defense of that knight on d5, a solid idea, and Daniel continues his plan, rook to f3 on the board, putting pressure on that pawn on f7, and as we're going to see, there are going to be a lot of sacrificial ideas with that rook flying into the f7 square in this game. All right, here, Magnus Carlsen, what should he be doing? Well, the most active idea I could find was the move h4, threatening the idea of h3 with that alpha 0 pawn on the h3 square. Of course, there were other ideas. For example, a4 expanding on the queen side, also playable, also a favorite idea of alpha 0. Instead, here in this position, Magnus does go knight to b6, putting pressure on that bishop on c4, trying to reroute the knight to a better square, and opening up the diagonal for the queen here. Now, in the game, Daniel's bishop is being threatened. He does not want to lose his bishop pair. That is just so important in this game. So with that in mind, he does retreat the bishop. Bishop d3 on the board, a decent idea. The idea being perhaps bishop e4 on the next move. However, I do want to point out, bishop b5, putting pressure on that queen on c6 with tempo, may have been a stronger move in the position. Now here, Magnus, he punishes this minor mistake with the move c4, gaining space on the queen side and forcing the bishop back to a weaker square. Now Daniel, bishop c2 on the board, and here Magnus jumps back with the knight to the d5 square, knight d5. So Magnus Carlsen making a little bit of progress on the queen side in this game. However, h4 again may have been a stronger idea in that position. Now here Daniel, a3 on the board, guarding against future knight to b4 ideas, and Magnus Carlsen, he continues on the queen side with the move c3. Of course, Magnus simply has to get counterplay going on the queen side if he wants to distract Daniel from the attack on the king side. The queen side is definitely where he's going to get his play in this game. Now here, Daniel, he doesn't take on c3. That would open up the queen side to Magnus Carlsen's benefit. So with that in mind, he just goes b3, giving Magnus a pass pawn on the c3 square. However, he keeps the queen side closed, and now he can focus on the king side where he is stronger. All right, I'm going to be a broken record here, but once again, Magnus Carlsen, he has to find the idea of h4, threatening h3 if he wants to stay in this game. However, he doesn't find that idea. That was the strongest continuation. Instead, he just goes rook d7 here, playing it safe. However, Daniel, he increases the pressure immediately with the very strong idea, queen to e4, again, threatening various ideas like rook takes f7 and then queen takes g6, not to mention pinning the knight on d5 to the queen on c6. So, Magnus, what is he going to do about it? Well, in this position, you simply have to find the idea of bishop d8, then the rook on d7 does defend the pawn on f7. That relieves a lot of the pressure on the king side. However, instead of that, here, Magnus Carlsen, he makes a big mistake. He retreats the queen back to the c7 square, queen c7 on the board, and of course, the idea behind this move, he wants to increase the pressure on e5, and he wants to get the queen out of the pin of the queen on d5 to his queen on c6. But as you can see by this evaluation bar on the left, this move was a massive blunder, and here Daniel, he spots the flaw with this move immediately, and he just crashes through with the rook on the f7 square. Rook takes f7 on the board, and I would have made that a puzzle if it wasn't already covered in the intro and the thumbnail of the video. So, rook takes f7 on the board, and now here Magnus, what the heck is he supposed to do? Well, if you don't take the rook, then queen takes g6 will effectively be game over on the spot. Therefore, king takes f7 is forced. That is the only way to stay in the game. But here Daniel, he follows up impeccably with the attack. He starts queen takes g6, the very obvious move. Now the king is forced back. It has to go to king to f8. That is the only legal move in the position. And now, of course, Daniel, he brings in the next piece. Bishop to h6, hitting the king, and now the king does not have any squares where it can go. All these squares are covered. Therefore, rook takes h6 is forced here by Magnus. So we have rook takes, then queen takes, and now once again, where is the king supposed to go? If you go king g8, then all sorts of ideas like bishop h7, queen g6 will be devastating. Therefore, king d8 is the only move, or sorry, king e8 is the only move giving you fighting chances. But here, Daniel, he finds the right continuation. Bishop g6 on the board, and in this position, Magnus Carlsen resigns on the spot to Daniel. There is no stopping the mating attack. The force sequence is king d8, queen h8, bishop f8, then queen takes bishop f8, and that will be checkmate on the spot. So wow, what a performance by Daniel in this game against Magnus Carlsen, leaving Vladimir Kramnik in complete and total shock, as he cannot believe Daniel is this good in Blitz without cheating. Wow, what a game. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button for me. Thank you so much for doing it. And while you're at it, check out this video right here, where Daniel Naroditsky puts on yet another attacking masterclass against Magnus Carlsen. And once again, Vladimir absolutely lost it when he saw that game. So check it out. I'm sure you're going to love it. And I'll see you in the next video.